All right, so we're back again. Going to talk all about the second Sharpe novel, Sharpe's Triumph, and I'm joined by Dan Davis. Dan, all right?
Hello. Hi.
So yeah, looking forward to this one, the second one, and it's still a prequel essentially. So I mean, it came out in the original novel came out in 1998, so it's after the first books he wrote, but it's a prequel. It's the second one chronologically in Richard Sharpe's life. So it's still in India. It's 1803, so it's about 3-4 years after the last book took place. Sharpe is still a sergeant, and the context of it is the second Anglo-Maratha War. So Dan, should I talk a little bit about that, or have you got anything to say straight off the bat about Sharpe's Triumph?
Yeah, no, I would just say that I thought this is a better book than the first one. Sharpe's Tiger was a bit unusual, I thought, for a Sharpe book. But this one, Triumph, is more kind of more formulaic. It fits the classic Sharpe formula, where it builds up to a huge, important battle. Yeah, I just thought it was a really good novel, a really good story, and with loads of excellent action. What did you think of it overall?
Yeah, exactly. That is my overall impression is that it's pretty much a classic Sharpe novel. Most of them are that. It's like starts off sort of low key, sort of zoomed in on Sharpe and his life and his affairs, and it sort of builds bigger and bigger. And there's a few sort of a few scenes of excitement, and then a big set piece battle at the end. That's what most of the books are quite often.
Yeah.
And this one is exactly that. So it's sort of a classic Sharpe novel. Yeah, so it's great.
Yeah. So what is the context then? The political climate in around 1803.
So in 1799, the same year that the Sharpe's Tiger was set, when they took Seringapatam, they also took Mysore in that year. It's the East India Company mainly. There is the King's Army there, but it's sort of nominally on paper and everything. It's people in control of the Honourable East India Company. They taken Mysore, which is in the south of India. I'll put a map up in post. It's all right. We'll sort it out in post production and put a map up and show that. The Maratha Confederacy controlled vast swathes of central and northern India, most of it really. And the Maratha Confederacy is 6 sort of Indian warlords, and one of them is a guy called Scindia, isn't it? The Scindia or Scindia, how do you say it?
I thought it was Scindia.
Right.
I don't
know.
The
Scindia of Guliwar.
Is it
Galiwar?
Garulgur?
Gawalgur.
Yeah, I thought that's what it was.
Gawalgur. I don't know how you pronounce that. Anyway, he's one of these 6, and in about, I think it was 1802 or maybe even earlier in 1803, at some point not too long before, he'd attacked Pune, which is on the west coast, sort of middle west side. It's not on of India, and the deposed ruler there came down to the British in Mysore and said, I'll put myself under your auspices if you help me take my seat back at Pune, which they did, and that was under Wellesley. But then, so after that, there's still this Maratha Confederacy, and Wellesley, who was he's called a general in this, isn't it? They keep calling him the general, and but he was only an acting general, just to get a bit neckbeardy about it. He was actually a colonel, but an acting major general to go push up. Because if you look on the map as well, Pune's not really anywhere near Mysore. It's a long way. But Wellesley just marches an army up to there, relieves Pune, I believe, without a shot fired. But then this Scindia is there. And so, well, they're sort of chased. Wellesley chases this army sort of into central India. And, well, that's where the events of Sharpe's Triumph, where the novel starts. So should I just jump straight into the actual sort of events, fictional or otherwise, of the actual novel?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because it's been quite a while since I actually read it last. I think I've probably read it 3 times, but I think the last time was over a year ago. So yeah, I kind of remember it, but yeah, if you want to go through it, that would refresh my memory for sure.
Okay, cool. So you remember there was a Dodd in the other one, Major Dodd, William Dodd or Lieutenant Dodd. So he comes into it because he's sort of the arch baddie really for these prequel novels. And anyway, the novel starts where Sharpe is pretending to be dead at a massacre. That's how the novel opens, where he's got all blood. He's got his eyes open, pretending to be dead, covered in blood amongst corpses. So it's
Oh,
one
oh
of
yeah,
those.
does a flyer land, like walk across his eyeball or something?
Yeah, yeah.
He has to try and not blink. Yeah.
Yeah, and some cartridges in a fire go off beside him, and he has to not flinch and stuff. So it opens with what Cornwell tells us right at the end is actually a completely fictional event, but that this small fort has been sort of backstabbed, and well, it transpires the scene, the opening scene, essentially is that Sharpe, as a sergeant, is in this sort of small, what would you call it, like a fort?
Yeah, it's a fortress that they've established in the area to maintain the supply lines across. Because, like you said, there's in this sort of Deccan area there are enormous distances that they have to cover and protect, and to maintain the supplies between these different outposts and cities, they have to establish all these little fortlets everywhere as bases. But obviously, they're relatively small and pretty vulnerable.
Yeah, and it's described that it's like a really sort of crappy makeshift rampart around this sort of small encampment thing, and an officer and some men come riding out of the horizon, like British officers, looks like, or East India Company officers come riding out of the horizon, and they're sort of welcomed into the gate, but then they sort of just present arms and then fire on everyone, including Sharpe, who's just there, killing everyone. And it's this Dodd, Major Dodd, that's in command of them, and that's sort of just like the Sharpe opening dramatic scene in Sharpe's triumph. And but Sharpe, what it is a weird thing, like a bit contrived, really. Sharpe does try to fight them, but gets shot in the head, and it knocks him out. But when he comes round, it's like miraculous that it was some sort of bullet graze. It obviously didn't go into his head or anything. He's sort of bleeding from the side of his head. It doesn't really make much sense, but yeah, that's what Cornwell does there. And Sharpe decides to pretend to be dead, or has to pretend to be dead.
Yeah.
And that's how he gets out of there alive, like the sole survivor, more or less.
Yeah, so it's a pretty great opening, immediately gripping, and it sets up the whole rest of the personal part of the plot, doesn't it? Because then he has the motivation to get revenge on Dodd throughout the whole story, and it kind of drives the plot that he needs to get revenge on this guy, and
Yeah,
that's set
because he
up.
sees Dodd, he clocks him, doesn't he? He recognises him.
Oh yeah, and that's why he gets taken along in the hunt to arrest him, because he can recognize him.
Yeah,
Right,
he can
right, right.
ID him. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so then the novel goes on to sort of cut to Dodd, and Dodd is you immediately find out is a renegade, like used to be in the British Army, but you get oh no, sorry, that's it. He used to be in the East India Company, but you don't get promoted fast at all in the East India Company, do you? Like you have to wait for people to retire or die, and so
Yeah, that's right. It's mostly on senior. It's mostly on like length of service. So
mm,
if you want to be promoted, you just have to wait. And so like it's just a matter of hanging around for years until the guy above you dies of a fever, and then you can get promoted.
yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
this
so you might have like a 45-year-old who's still like only an ensign or something. It's really humiliating when if you know,
yeah, so a very interesting company, isn't it? East India Company. The fact that it's like the British Army, but it's also very different and very bureaucratic. But yeah, I didn't realize that Dodd guy was based on a real person. So
yeah,
he says it at the end, doesn't he, in the
yeah,
author's note?
yeah. He says that this massacre is completely fictional, but there really was a Dodd. Or the other part to the other reason why he defected, because he's now a renegade working for the Indian side. That's why he does this massacre. The other main reason he says, Cornwell says, is that he ordered or he had been swindled by some sort of goldsmith,
Yeah,
an
I
Indian goldsmith. So he'd ordered his men to go beat him up, which they did, but he killed him. And then he was brought up on charges for that and given like a really mild, like some sort of small fine. And Wellesley hears of that and says that's nonsense and makes him get dismissed from the army. And once he's back in England, he's going to bring him up on actual trial for murder in England. And when Dodd hears that this is what Wellesley intends, he defects.
all that actually happened. That is the
Yeah, and all
real
that's
history
real.
that Cornwell draws on. But the massacre part isn't real. But that Dodd character is amazing. The fact that he was a sergeant in the East India Company, and then he ends up being, what is he, a major or something in the Marathas forces.
Yeah, I think he was a really junior officer, but yeah, he goes over to, well, that's the next scene. He goes, they make him turn him from a major to a colonel, or from a lieutenant to a
Right.
major, I think it is, because you go into the next scene is he goes and sees his superior, who's in charge of all the Scindia's armies,
Yeah.
who is they keep calling him the Hanoverian, is Pohlmann, Anthony Pohlmann,
Yeah.
Colonel
Again,
Anthony Pohlmann, who's a real, yeah.
another real figure. Yeah. There were loads of these kind of European mercenaries or gentlemen adventurers or whatever you call them, where they were taking their military experience from Europe and America and going to work for the Marathas, to command their armies, or at least serve as officers in their armies, and kind of transfer that European and American military or modern military experience, and provide that to the Indian forces. There were loads of them. There were, like, when you look at the forces in the battle later, there were so many. The battalions were commanded by Portuguese and Italians and Dutch and Germans, and also mixed race people, that where their father had been a European adventurer officer who'd married a local woman, and then you had these mixed race officers who were doing the same sort of job. So yeah, there's this whole culture of these foreign mercenaries operating against the British.
Yeah, yeah, and this Anthony Pullman is certainly one of them. It says he was a sergeant. He was a sergeant in the East India
Oh,
Company.
he was the sergeant. Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and I think he says within the space of 10 years, he's in control of the Scindia's armies as a colonel. And when Cornwell describes him, he's like on the back of this massive bejeweled painted elephant, and and it's
yeah,
got like wears loads and loads of bejeweled things, like a fantastically elaborate and rich sword and all this sort of thing.
yeah. That's amazing, and accurate as well, historically accurate. That is how he went about. And yeah, and he'd been a sergeant just in the East India Company. So yeah, it just goes to show that for some men it was the correct decision, to leave the East India Company and go and work for the Marathas, because you could earn a hell of a lot more.
Yeah, it says he's got like three other elephants, and they're just loaded down with his gold. And wherever he goes, they go at all times. Yeah, like there's a thing. It's like in The Man Who Would Be King, and there's like treasure and glory to be found for those who know how to drill men.
Yeah, right.
It's sort of like that. That's only just really crossed my mind. It's funny. That's only just crossed my mind, but
Yeah,
uh, that is like actually was a sergeant, and now he's yeah like yeah, not an independent sovereign ruler. Although it says he dreams of being a prince somewhere later, but
yeah,
he's just supremely powerful and very very rich. And he tells this Dodd, he's like, "Well done for that massacre. You've just." He seized, part of the plot is that he seized 80,000 cartridges from the British Army there and stole them over to their side. And so Pullman is happy with him and gives him another mission, which is to get a regiment out of Ahmednagar, the town of Ahmednagar. How are you pronouncing that?
I think it's Ahmednagar.
Ahmednagar.
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah, which is a walled, fortified town, isn't it? Like a fairly decent sized town. And the Scindia's got some men in there, and if Dodd is successful, he'll be in charge of that whole regiment, the Cobras, the white-coated Cobras. It keeps describing them as, and it's going to be assaulted soon by the British that are like on the horizon. You can sort of see the smoke from their camps on the horizon, like just a day or two's march out. And it's like some of the tension builds, and Cornwall builds it a bit, and it's like one of the sort of another big action scene in the novel.
yeah. The storming of the city, or the
Yeah,
town, really. Yeah, which is one of Wellesley's first really impressive victories, isn't it? In real life, where the normal way of taking a well fortified town like that would obviously be to establish some sort of defensive line for yourself, and then set up your cannons, your artillery, and then start blasting a hole through the wall to make one or more breaches, which you then send your forces through to take the city. So that's what everyone really expected him to do, because that was really how it was done, but that isn't what he did, is it?
But all that takes like 2 or 3 days, maybe, doesn't it, to do
At
that?
least, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. The boy Wellesley decides to go for an escalade, which is running up to the wall with some ladders, throwing the ladders against the wall and running up the ladders, and just as simple as that.
Yeah, on
Um,
maths.
Against a defended wall. And so that's what they do, an escalade, which is really ballsy. But the whole point of it is that hopefully, wherever you do it, the wall won't be that heavily defended because they won't expect you to do it. You have to do it quickly, before any part of the wall is massively reinforced and defended.
Yeah.
So the whole point is you do it quick, and so yeah, that's what he does, and everyone's surprised. You actually see a nice little scene. I think it's really nice in the novel where, because Sharpe gets attached to Wellesley's staff, and you see that the moment when Wellesley gets the intelligence that they're going to have to almost certainly attack this town, and he like really quickly has like a flurry of issues out a flurry of orders, or has a quick meeting with his very very senior officers to just quickly decide what they're going to do. And obviously in that moment is when he decides he's going to do an escalade. And yeah, you also see it like a bit later. Cornwell shows this it from the perspective of on top of the walls, that they can't quite believe that there's these these really small parties of just a few dozen men, sort of rushing, coming out of the brush, coming out of nowhere, and running across the no man's land towards the walls with holding some ladders. Like, oh, that's it. It's 2 ladders. They've only got 2 ladders,
Oh my
and
God.
there's just like this handful of men running across the open ground, and the defenders, or the guy on the wall, it's Dodd actually, is on the wall. Like he's like, surely they're not gonna do an escalade. No, come on. And he kicks himself, Dodd, because he's got a really low opinion of Wellesley when he calls him the boy Wellesley, even though I think Arthur Wellesley was in his mid-30s by this point. But
How was he that old? Right.
I think so, yeah.
Right.
He's got a really low opinion of him, that he
Mm.
certainly wouldn't have the balls to try and escalade. But he does, yeah, and that's what they do. And we get a bit of the description in the novel, but it's a hellacious thing to try, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could try to imagine being the first guy up one of those ladders. I mean, how would you even do it? How would you fight? You know, if you're the first one up, maybe if you're the very first one and they're taken by surprise, maybe you can get over the wall. But if there's people at the top of the wall and they want to stop you getting up with their bayonet or whatever, like, can you imagine how hard it would be to fight your way through that? I mean, yeah, it's astonishing that these kind of things happened at all. But in this case, I think it's quite surprising because maybe for us looking back now, because Wellesley has this reputation as a brilliant defensive general, right? He in the Peninsula and Waterloo, he tended to always be the one on the defensive, and he had that reputation of knowing how to position his men in the landscape to best weather the attacking French superior numbers, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Peninsula is largely a defensive war from our point of view, isn't it? So yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, especially the first part of
At
it.
least the first bit, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But in this and in Assay later, and in the next book, he's obviously attacking extremely aggressively. In all of these big kind of clashes, he's just going full pelt at it.
Yeah.
Which you can kind of he could be criticised for it because it's risky and causes a lot more casualties for your side. But also you can see how successful it was because if he had taken the time to invest in blasting a hole through the wall, I think his thinking was I don't know if it's in the novel, but because there were I think the walls, it was quite a big town, and the walls were something like 4,000 yards in total, all the way around. And there were only, I don't know, 2,000, there's like 1,000 Arab mercenaries in there defending it. And there's about 1,000 or maybe 2,000 of the Maratha troops in there. And he calculates that there's not enough of them to defend the wall entirely with any strength. But if you took the time to make breaches, then they would know where the British were going to come through, and then they could concentrate their forces around the breaches, and it would be more bloody.
Mm.
So it was a calculated risk to try and attack over the walls really quickly. But they pulled it off. There was a guy, I think the first guy over the wall, or the guy leading the party, was a Scotsman who they talk about in the novel, don't they? Is it Campbell?
Yeah,
Um,
Campbell.
and he was a real guy. Which and he got promoted for that action, I think.
Yeah, he did. So it was one of the Highland regiments, I think, that was charged with doing that, going over the walls, that escalade. And it says in the novel that the first few guys sort of obviously are killed. They said they're throwing big stones down, which there'd be loads of guys on a ladder, and one massive rock would like wipe them all out.
Oh, Jesus.
And but anyway, when the few guys do actually get to the top, they like pause there, and everyone watching, including Sharpe and McCandless and Wellesley, and everyone like, "Come on, man, what are you doing?" and then they don't realise what's going on, and other guys get to the top and pause and don't jump over the rampart, and they can't really understand why. And then they realise that it's just a straight drop all the way down the other side.
There's no fire step on the other
There's no
side.
fire step on the other side, so they have to sort of abandon that particular patch of wall and start again somewhere else. And that's sort of the whole point is defeated at that point, because you needed the element of surprise, which is definitely gone now. But in the end, they do get over somehow. Like the description of it is sort of quite heart in your mouth stuff, even though you're just reading. You know that sometimes when you're reading and you're actually like your heart's beating a bit. It's a great writing by Cornwell to be able to do
Definitely. I think Cornwell's the best at that. I think Cornwell and a few others like Christian Cameron, but in this book and the next book, the attack on the big fortress in the next one, that's some of his best writing, I think. It's most enthralling and just, you can totally get lost in it. It's brilliant. And I love the fact that he takes so much time in it. You know, like some books you read, the action part is over in a few pages, but Cornwell puts a lot of effort into it, and it lasts for pages and pages, doesn't it? And gives you a chance to really, really get in there with them. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the end, one of the guys, it gets over right at the end as well. And that, always to mention Cornwall's historic note at the end of the novel, because they're always great. They're always too short. I wish he'd write more there.
Yeah.
But he mentions that guy, Campbell, became Sir Colin Campbell and became governor of Ceylon.
Right.
In the end. Oh, yeah, his reward for being first over the wall was battlefield promotion and being attached to Wellesley's staff. So
Right.
obviously that's where he
and
sort of got his connections for sort of later in life and everything. So
I think he then served on Wellesley's staff from then on. Basically, I think he was still working for Wellesley. Well, maybe at Waterloo as well. Certainly for years and years. Yeah.
Well, because of course, just real quick to say is that Arthur Wellesley goes on to become Prime Minister a couple of times. He goes on to become even more powerful. And has a really long life and is still involved in politics and stuff for many, many more decades. But the British Army do get inside. How are you saying it? Ahmednagar.
Yeah, Ahmednagar, I think.
Ahmednagar. They get inside, and Dodd and his regiment escape out the back. And there's a couple of characters, perhaps real quick to mention, sort of secondary characters of a French artillery officer under Dodd called Joubert and his wife. Simone,
yes.
who Sharpe has a bit of a tryst with.
Yeah, his smoking hot, bored young wife. Yeah.
Yeah. And at one point she gets separated, and Sharpe saves her life, and then it's quite Bernard Cornwell's quite delicate about it, but Sharpe does just bed her that evening. Sort of looks after her. I think at one point McCandless, the officer, the intelligence officer, the Scottish guy that is sort of under Sharpe's senior officer, does say, look after her, make sure she's not sort of raped or anything. But she falls for Sharpe, of course. And also another sort of another subplot in there is Hakeswheel is in it still. And in fact, the Hakeswheel subplot is just real quick that he has told another colonel, you don't really see much of Colonel Gore, that Sharpe had assaulted some other officer, some major, and that he needs to be arrested. And that Colonel Gore believed Hakeswheel, so he's got this warrant to arrest Sharpe. So out there, all through this novel, is Hakeswheel and a sort of squad of 6 men that are trying to arrest Sharpe for a fictional assault. Hakeswheel's sort of after him.
Yeah, and what he really wants is his jewels, right? Because Hakeswell suspects or knows, I can't remember, that Sharpe has still got most of the riches that he robbed off of the Tipu Sultan from the previous book. And so the arrest warrant is an ulterior motive to allow Hakeswell to be detached from his force to go after Sharpe, and basically will kill him and say that he resisted arrest, and then take all of his riches for himself. I think that's right.
Yeah, no, that's Hakeswell's plan, is that he will have, whilst bringing him back, he will have tried to escape arrest and will be killed, and And so that's another big part of the plot, is that Sharpe has definitely got loads of pearls and diamonds and the massive ruby of the Tipu. He's still got it all, and he's got loads of it sewn into his jacket. And it's sort of it's a real problem what he's going to do with all these jewels, really, how to hide them all the time.
Everyone all of his men notice that he never leaves his pack alone for a second. They're like, what's he got in there? He must have something good in there. But he's got a literal fortune in there. But there's no way you could realistically spend any of it. You just couldn't do it, could you? If you're just a private soldier, you wouldn't be able to do that, would you?
Yeah, I think it says at one point that he's able to somehow barter away one of the gemstones somehow, and he knew he got sort of swindled, got a bad price for it. But it would be really difficult, wouldn't it? Especially a massive, any sort of really big stone, especially in those days as well. Like, what are you doing with this?
Yeah, how would you do it?
Yeah. So there's the officer, it's like an intelligence officer, Colonel McCandless, that they was in the dungeons of Seringapatam with, you remember? And so he's a big part of it, and he takes Sharpe off because he has to try and find Dodd as well. The actual authorities, when they realised Dodd, because Wellesley wanted him up on charges for murder back in London, and when they realised he's absconded, he's deserted, the authorities want him back, and they've sent McCandless to go and do it. And he knows Sharpe. He's brilliant soldiering. So it's him and Sharpe sort of go off into the Indian wilderness behind enemy lines again to try and find Dodd. So that's sort of what they're doing. I'll just move on with that, because it is one part of the novel where it slows down a bit, actually, this sort of middle chunk of it. And they do find him, and because they're sort of officers and gentlemen, and because Pohlmann is a European, he doesn't kill them or anything. He just invites them to dinner. I mean, it's a colonel. So anyway, he invites them to dinner, and they're sort of at dinner with Dodd and stuff, and everyone knows the deal. Dodd knows they're there to get him, and that they're sort of intelligence gathering people, but they're not. It's actually really gentlemanly. Like Pohlmann says, as my words as a gentleman and officer, even though I used to be a sergeant, you shan't be harmed. But in the night, they are actually, he gets shot. McCandless gets wounded when his horse is stolen.
Which is Dodd.
By Dodd's men,
Yeah.
And then, as I say, the novel slows down a bit while McCandless recovers. But just to zoom out a bit, Wellesley's armies are chasing the Maratha army across India, and in the end they sort of turn around and have to fight. And there's quite a few pages of the cat and mouse back and forth. Where are they? And some of the men grumbling in the army, we've come back across this river for a second time now. What are our officers doing? They don't even know what they're doing. But of course, the mind of Wellesley is rapier sharp, and he eventually gets them in a position where they feel like they have to turn around and face the British. And it's near the town of Assay.
Yeah, but it's a little village called Assay, isn't it? A little tiny, relatively small village.
Yeah, small.
Amongst a few other small villages. It's funny, isn't it? Right? It's how some battles get their name from just one random tiny place that's nearby.
Like Agincourt springs to mind, the tiny hamlet of Agincourt in the middle of some fields. Indistinguishable from a dozen around it. But that is a super famous name for all time.
But no, you're right. I think that bit probably slows down to allow the passage of time to pass by, because it takes. I think Wellesley has to march his army something like 300 miles, doesn't he?
On the map, it's vast distances. Silly.
Yeah, and it's a really harsh landscape that they have to march through. It's quite. I think it's quite dry. Like even for northern India, I think there's they're in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats, and it's just this loads of really flat river valleys, but also some really horrific rock outcrops, and they are not in a great place by the time they get to Assay or to the battle. the British have been marching, and their lines have been extending more and more and more. And Wellesley makes this decision, doesn't he, to separate his forces into two. He takes the larger, and he sends one of his colonels, the colonel junior to him, with
It's
the other part
the
of the army.
Stevenson. Are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so they decide, or Wellesley decides, that he needs to catch up. He knows that he's getting close to the Scindia's forces, so he needs to move as fast as possible to try and catch him. Because what he wants is a battle. What he wants is to have a big engagement and win it and defeat the enemy in the field, and then sort out a political solution. But because the enemy is retreating and retreating constantly, he is really struggling to catch up. So I think he makes a base at one of the towns, and he leaves his not the baggage train, but he leaves the kind of the hangers on, the civilian part of the marching army at this town. And then he says, we know the enemy are up by this other town, something like 15 miles away. So what we're going to do is make sure, because we know that they outnumber us, and we know that so many of them are mounted and all the rest of it. So what we need to do is catch them unawares and catch them in such a way that they can't get away, and we can force an engagement. So he thinks the best way to do it is to go by two roads as fast as possible, and by separating his army into two, he will, each of those halves will be able to move much faster along those the two separate routes. But they're actually separated by a line of hills, so they cannot actually communicate with each other. But Wellesley's idea was that they would march really, really fast either side of this row of hills, and then join up on the other side, and then do the final part and engage the enemy at this other town. But what happens is Wellesley takes the eastern route around these hills, and when he gets close to where he was going to meet up with Stevenson, he sees that the enemy isn't where he thought it would be. This army is actually about 6 miles closer, right in front of him, across a river, and he realizes he has a big decision to make.
Yeah. So, I mean, this battle is considered one of Wellesley's finest battles, one of his finest moments in terms of just pure military history. But it must be, you've got to remember that it's his first big battle where he's in the overall command, where there's, full infantry and artillery and cavalry all entirely at his disposal. It's for the first time, this. And what Cornwell says quite a few times, stresses over and over, really, and I think he's true, I'm almost certainly sure he's true, is that he was brimming with confidence and happiness about it. Didn't seem to be scared or apprehensive whatsoever. And we're massively outnumbered. In the book, he says that the Indians had, he keeps saying different numbers, but maybe even as much as like 100,000, 80,000 or 100,000 guys, including mostly horsemen. And the British maybe had 15,000 infantry. Just looking on Wikipedia, it says that we had 9,500. And anyway, we had something like 17 cannon, but they had over 100. And they're good. They've got good cannon and good artillerymen as well. But anyway, we're outnumbered hugely, massively. But just before we get into the actual sort of little details of the battle itself, one other scene that it shows in the book beforehand is that, as you mentioned, Wellesley is the British are sort of chasing them a little bit. They keep, even though they've got this massive horde, three big compos they're called, aren't they? These battle groups. Three of them have come together, and they're in this giant host, maybe 50, 60, 70, 80,000 big, whatever it is. It's this giant army, and Pohlmann's in charge of them all. And Cornwell gives us this scene where all the sort of, what's the word, the Brahmin class on the Indian side all get together and have like this a version of a massive town hall, and the Scindia himself is there. And they're all really, really sort of scared and conservative and don't want to engage in battle, would rather just keep retreating or running away. But in the end, they ask Pohlmann himself, and he's full of confidence. He says, we can beat them. We can beat the British easily. And anyway, it's again, Cornwell paints just a good scene of this. What's the actual word, of when they have that council of war, basically, on the Indian side?
Yeah. No, it's fascinating, and it's interesting because, in a way, the Scindia's view would probably have been a better tactic, and it's what they were used to in that area. So the Marathas were used to, because the landscape is this huge. There are huge plains basically. It's a very open landscape. So they have a culture of this raiding, basically, really mobile light horsemen and raiders. And because and these warlords were based in well, the smaller ones were based in fortified villages, but the big powerful princes they had these massive fortresses on top of these enormous rock outcrops that were extremely well defended. So it meant that they could retreat there whenever they were in trouble, and no one could really get them out of there. And then they could come out again and carry on their raiding, and that was how they'd done war for, well, centuries really. And that's what Scindia was trying to do. He kept saying, you know, I can go back to Gawil Gur and I'll be safe there because there's no way that the British can defeat me there. So that would be the better tactic. And Pohlmann was overconfident, I guess.
Yeah, so the Scindia's sort of home fortress is, how are you saying that? Galigulur?
I think it's Gawil Gur.
Gawil Gur.
Yeah.
Right. So that's like his fortress. And the next book in the Sharpe novel sequence is Sharpe's Fortress, which is about that, isn't it?
Mm.
But we won't get onto that. So yeah, the European, the Hanoverian Pohlmann has convinced the Scindia's army to sort of stand, and his plan is that there's this river where there's the story goes, whenever you hear about Assay, it's always about these fords, the fords in the river. That there was only this apparently one or two fords that you could get across this river. So Pohlmann sets up his guns and his infantry.
Well, just
so
one,
because he
isn't it?
thinks the English will, yeah, just one, yeah, because he thinks the English will be
he thinks there's only
funneled.
one. Yeah, his belief is that there's only one ford, which is what the locals say, and his intelligence people say, and that's what Wellesley is told as well by the local people. That is the only ford. That is the only way across the river. So Pohlmann's entire strategy, or his tactics for that battle, were based on that piece of information, right? Like that's where the British have to cross. So that's how Pohlmann sets up his army.
Yeah, he expects them all to be funneled across this one ford in the river, and so yeah, he sets everything up so that it will just be a great sort of killing field, sort of a kill box, right? But Wellesley is riding ahead of the English, of his column of the British army, and he immediately recognises that that's silly, or that's what's going on, that's what's in the mind of the enemy commander, and so he's not going to do that. And he sees, and Cornwell tells us at the end in his historical note again that this is actually true, that Wellesley personally sees another couple of hamlets further down the river, a few miles, 2 or 3 miles or something, just down the river, seem to be undefended on his side of the river. And he notices that this hamlet sort of straddles the river, that there's sort of buildings and things on both sides. And he says to his, sort of Indian scouts, "Are you sure there's not a ford over there?" And they say, no, there's definitely not. And he says, but I've never in my life before seen a town or a village or a hamlet like that straddles a river where there isn't some sort of ford. That doesn't make any sense. But his scouts insist there isn't. And he just says, nonsense, we'll march the whole army across there. And without reconnoitering it, or without scouting it, orders that, of course, to outflank the enemy army, to like attack them on their left flank, essentially outflank them. And it does say that it's only when Wellesley himself first rides his horse into the river there, into the stream, to see if it's shallow enough to get the army and the guns across, before they realise that it is. His instinct, his gut was right. His eye for the battlefield was served him well. You know, Wellesley does seem to have the touch, doesn't he?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the confidence necessary to make decisions like that. But yeah, I think his reading of the landscape is pretty much maybe his most genius battlefield trait, really, because he does it repeatedly through the Peninsular campaign. But yeah, I mean, this is because you rely on your local experts, right? You rely on your local scouts to give you the information, because you just don't know. You've got no idea, right? So you have to rely on their word. So you'd be used to that as a foreign officer. You'd be completely reliant on the local people's experience and expertise. And if they're saying no, that's not the case, you know, you'd have to have extreme self-belief, really, to say no. We're going to do this. But yeah, and it almost costs him his life, doesn't it? Because he decides to test the ford and starts riding his horse through, and the enemy spot him, don't they? And they
Yeah.
turn their guns on him.
Yeah, just one thing you said about that having to rely on your sort of native scouts or what are to you foreign scouts. I think that's obviously sort of kind of when you think about it all through time. I think how much someone like Alexander or Hannibal would have to rely on the word of their newly captured scouts. I mean, it's mad, isn't it? And how much that must have played out throughout
Yeah, and
the history of wars.
yeah, and it gives the local people an opportunity to undermine the foreigners as well, doesn't it? Because you can,
Yeah, if they've got the balls, yeah.
yeah, you can give incorrect information,
Yeah.
and that is actually what happened. Well, is possibly what happened with Stevenson.
Oh, yeah, he was given some duff info, wasn't he?
Yeah, so Stevenson was late to the battle, so Wellesley makes a decision to attack without having met up with Stevenson, and Stevenson and his army, his detachment of the army was late, and he blames it on his local scout who took him the wrong way or something. And then after the battle, he had that scout executed. He hanged him because he thought he must have been in the pay of the enemy, or just a loyal Hindu guy who wanted to screw over the British. Or maybe it was a genuine mistake, but Stevenson had him hanged anyway.
Mm. Yeah, because as you said before, the whole point was that Wellesley had expected his army to be almost twice as big as it was. But the whole point of him outflanking Pohlmann was that it had to be done right away, otherwise
Mm.
it wouldn't work. And so
Yeah, so
again, a bit like the ordering the escalade. It's like, okay, if we're going to do this, then it has to be done right now, like
yeah,
really right now.
yeah,
And so yeah, when he first leads them through the ford, I'll put up a map or something so people can see. But the enemy gunners, at least for a moment, could sort of see what was happening or what he planned to do, and so they turned their longest range guns on them. They've got a couple. They keep saying they've got a couple of really long range 18-pounders or something like heavy siege guns. And in fact, Wellesley's sort of adjutant or sort of personal, his PA, the guy that's with him that brings like loads of canteens of water and a couple of extra horses.
yeah, his
Um,
orderly.
his
Yeah,
orderly, that's it.
yeah,
He gets killed by one of these really long range shots right there on when they first go to cross the river, ford the river.
yeah.
And
It
in
whips his
sorry,
head off, doesn't it?
yeah, well, that's that's how Bernard Cornwell describes it. Yeah, it blows his head completely off.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so he was a dragoon, an orderly, yeah, with Wellesley's spare horses. Yeah, and that that a couple of more feet to the left or whatever, and that could have been Wellesley's head, and that would have been it.
yeah. Oh, just to, if I didn't make it clear, that really happened.
Yeah,
That's shown in the novel, and it really happened. But what we don't know is who took that poor orderly's place in real life. We don't know. But in the book, it's Sharpe. Sharpe
yeah,
happens to be there, or he's actually already on Wellesley's. He's near to Wellesley anyway, and he's just said, Wellesley just said, "You take over, Sharpe, take over." And so for the rest of the battle, Sharpe is sort of shadowing Wellesley, who is on the front line a lot of the time, with like a couple of spare horses and like these half a dozen canteens of water, and he's just trotting around behind Wellesley and his staff. So you get to see the battle more basically from Wellesley's point of view quite a lot, which is again just a sort of a masterful way of telling the story, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. Because really, on some level, the whole Sharpe series is also the story of Wellesley's Wellesley's military career. So it's Sharpe's as well, the fictional Sharpe, but it's also really closely follows Wellesley, doesn't it? The whole series. Um, so yeah, this is really excellent way of doing it.
And there's one bit where Sharpe actually has to sort of go in the thick of it briefly, and he's on a horse, and he says this is his first big sort of set piece battle that he's been in. He's at the siege of Seringapatam and a couple of other firefights, but this is his first big battle, and he's surprised that he never thought he'd be going into battle as a cavalryman, essentially with a big heavy sword, big heavy cavalryman sword. He always thought he'd be, because he's an infantryman, really, isn't he? He's still
Yeah,
supposed to be a sergeant in the infantry. But yeah, so I suppose the battle kicks off. But Pohlmann is sort of, he's no fool. He sees what's happening and pretty much immediately orders his entire battle line to shift and move to face where the British, where Wellesley's battle line is obviously going to be once they've crossed this ford. So he moves them all, and apparently he does it really professionally. That's true, isn't it? And people in the book and in real life, all the senior officers and Wellesley himself on the British side are like, "Oh, well done, smartly done," you know.
Yeah, well, that was really key to Wellesley's plan, wasn't it? The idea was Pohlmann's entire army was in position, and the guns were in position, and his battalions were in position, and repositioning quickly and efficiently and accurately during a battle is extremely difficult. It's really easy for troops to get confused and to start jamming each other up, and in that confusion, it can all just go to shit really quickly. And Wellesley was hoping to get across so quickly that he could then basically attack Pohlmann's line from the flank, right? So that was the idea: get across so quickly, and then instantly put in his battalions in two lines, and try and roll up basically Pohlmann's line. But as you say, Pohlmann actually repositioned way quicker than Wellesley expected, and that could have lost the whole battle. Just that the fact that they did that so efficiently was not what Wellesley expected, and that could have been it. But somehow it wasn't.
Yeah, so Wellesley's whole plan of trying to outflank him has essentially been foiled by that very sort of quick, expertly done manoeuvring, especially with all the cannon. They've got like loads of cannon. We're outgunned. Apparently, a few of the British cannons did get across the ford and sort of start opening fire, but they were sort of outgunned because he's got, I think it says 20 or 40 guns, and we've got like 2 or something. That exchange is an unfair one.
Yeah, I think the Indians had 102 cannon.
That's in total.
Yeah.
But I just mean, sorry, go on.
And then the British, had about a dozen or something like that. And it should really emphasize that the Indians, their artillery is excellent. Their infantry are quite good and well led, but their artillery, their cannons are excellent. The cannons themselves are really high quality, and the crews are also excellent. And they are probably the main danger. There are thousands, like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 horsemen, but they're not really that dangerous. But to the British, but the cannons they cause most of the casualties on the British side, and they were the main concern. And the way that the Indians especially liked to because in European war, the fashion or the tactics were to have these batteries, right? You set up batteries around the battlefield to cover the infantry fight, right? So you have these individual batteries, maybe on a rise or somewhere that's positioned that can fulfill the aims of the general, right? So you'd have a battery over there and one over there and one over there, but the Indians liked to put their cannons out in front, in a line, basically in front of their battalions of infantry, which is quite unusual. But their artillery was so good that was often how they won the day, because they would just defeat any approaching infantry before there was an infantry battle to fight. They could usually defeat the enemy with their artillery before there was an infantry duel.
Yeah, and they're gunning. Their crews are sort of very well drilled and quite often led by a European officer. So as far as the enemy are concerned, getting the ammo incoming, they're almost as good as, or pretty much just as good as, any European artillery crew.
Yeah, for sure. You know?
Yeah, and they keep it's more than 20,000. It's maybe 30 or maybe 40,000, maybe more, sort of irregular cavalry, sort of always waiting behind the infantry and guns to see how that goes. Like this just giant swirling force of almost endless horsemen that are sort of there, ominous. So where Pohlmann has been able to move his line, that's changed the battle. So now the town of Assay, the village of Assay, is sort of on his now extreme left, on our extreme right of the battle line. But so where Wellesley has been sort of foiled to get that sort of really sweet action of rolling up his line, of flanking him, where he hasn't got that, what he has done now, though, forced Pohlmann's line to be so much shorter that his sort of numerical advantage in infantry is sort of nullified largely, and so you get lines of redcoats lining up, sepoy battalions, and the Highlanders. There's a 74th and the 78th are there, and they line up and they start walking towards the guns, and so the battle proper starts.
Yeah, and this is where you get most of the British casualties. It's really horrific. So, but yeah, as you say, because actually the battlefield is now between two rivers, right? So Assay is on the banks of the Northern River, and it's very heavily defended. And the British have just crossed the other river, and now they're kind of on a spit of land, right, between these two rivers. So, yeah, as you say, the Indians now can't use their greater numbers to easily outflank. So, in a way, they've kind of nullified their great advantage there. But still, Wellesley still hasn't got enough men to create an equally wide flank. He initially arranges his battalions in two lines, but then he realizes that actually his two lines would only be half the width of the Indian line. So he decides to he directs some of the battalions from the rear onto his right to extend his line on the right-hand side. But he does that at the same time as he orders his front line to advance into the fire. And this is where you get a really terrible mistake, right? Where Wellesley's orders weren't clear enough, or whether the officer in charge of the battalion is just his wits fail him under fire or something. Instead of moving out to the right and joining onto the right-hand side of the line as it advances, he moves out to the right and then continues at a diagonal, an oblique angle straight towards the village of Assay. And he basically marches this battalion, and it's the battalion of pickets. So it's the kind of a battalion made up of the detachments from all of the other battalions. It's like a scratch force basically, but it is a battalion size. I think it's about 500 men, and yeah, it just marches basically obliquely across the front of the entire enemy left, and receiving just horrific artillery fire, getting shredded, and then marching straight up towards Assay, which is bristling with muskets and guns, and then they get shredded there, and then they fall back, and that's all happening whilst the line on the left, which is the only line, advances towards the Indians. So that is a terrible mistake, which costs hundreds of lives and could almost lose the battle at this point. And then there's another, is it the 74th or the 78th? 74th, I think, are supposed to also join the right hand of the line with the battalion of detachments. But instead of, I think the officer in charge of the 74th? Instead of following his orders, whether he misunderstood his orders as well, we don't know. But instead of actually joining the end of the line like he was supposed to, he decides to advance after the battalion of detachments and tries to rescue them, or tries to fight with to protect them from this horrific disaster that's happening. So that's all unfolding on the right-hand side of the battle, whilst the sepoy battalions and the Highlanders are walking slowly towards this horrific cannon fire.
Yeah. So that guy that moved too far to the right, our right, that created a hole in our line in the middle, and that's not what Wellesley planned at all. He was supposed to move obliquely to the right a bit, but certainly not attack the town of Assay, because that was massively heavily defended, and Wellesley's whole plan was to attack on our left, beat them on the left, roll them up, and anyone that's left will be penned in Assay, and then there could be a final, you can then sort of regroup and there could be a final attack on Assay, and that's the plan. But where this guy's sort of gone straight for it and left a hole in the middle, that wasn't the plan. And it's a little bit later in the novel when they talk about how they a lot of their pickets get blown apart. A load of the pickets get killed, just because they're sent into the moor of fire just outside the walls of Assay. There'd be flying pickets everywhere, and and in fact, Bernard Cornwell puts Dodd there in Assay, commanding the defence of Assay, which of course we don't know if the real Dodd was there or anything like that. Probably not, but nevertheless, I've got a couple of quick quotes from the book. Do you mind if I read one or two out real quick at this point?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, for sure.
Because Cornwell is a really great writer. He writes this one anyway. This is as the British and mainly the Highlanders advance on the guns. Quote: They were firing at 700 yards now, much too far for canister, but a round shot could whip a file into bloody scraps in the blinking of an eye. The sound of the guns was unending, one shot melding into the next, and the whole making a thunderous noise of deafening violence. The enemy line was shrouded in grey-white smoke, which was constantly lit by flashes of gunfire deep in the smoke's heart. Sometimes a Maratha battery would pause to let the smoke thin, and Sharpe, riding 20 paces behind the general, who was advancing just to the right of the 78th, could watch the enemy gunners heave at their pieces, see them back away as the gun captain swung the linstock over the barrel. Then the gun would disappear again in a cloud of powder and smoke, and an instant later a ball would plunge down in front of the infantry. Sometimes it would bounce clean over the men's heads, but too often the heavy shots slammed into the files and men would be broken apart in a spray of blood. End quote.
Yes.
So yeah,
Savage.
Yeah, there's quite a lot. Again, Cornwell does go into a fair bit of detail. You've got pages and pages. Like the whole sort of last quarter of the book, maybe last third, is the battle.
Right. Yeah.
So it's good if you're reading for that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, this is the amazing thing that the Highlanders were on the extreme left of the British line, and they just marched straight into this horrific cannon fire, and it was killing them. They were just standing up, walking straight towards it, and they were just getting blown to pieces, but they just carried on. And then the sepoy battalions to their right were a little bit slower, a little bit less keen to march straight into the cannon fire. But Cornwell suggests, and maybe he's right, that it's the example of the Highlanders that gave courage to the sepoy battalions. You know, that ahead of them on the far left, you've got these giant Highlanders marching straight into it, and they're doing okay. They're all right. So the sepoys were given the courage to follow on a little bit behind them, and then so they march up to within 50 yards of the cannon, which is pretty close, isn't it?
Yeah.
In standing, and they come to a stop and present their muskets, and they fire a volley, and they've got their bayonets already fixed at this point. So the obvious thing to do would be to give them a volley and then run the final 50 yards and finish them off. But actually, they're ordered to stand and reload and give them another volley before charging, which is remarkable that they could have the courage to stand there. You know, so they give the one volley, and then they reload, fire, and then they're ordered to charge in and finish off the gun crews. And then that happens along the rest of the British line as well. So the sepoy battalions do the same thing, and then the British line is then in half of the Indian. So you imagine there's the line of the cannons first, and then behind the cannons there's the infantry battalions standing there, and they haven't been able to fire yet because their gun crews are in the way. So once the gun crews have been killed or at least incapacitated, because this is an issue that something happens later in the battle that the British then have to come and rectify. But the gun crews are shredded, laying around, they've given up, whatever. So then the Highlanders and the sepoys take position behind the guns to then fire on the Indian infantry. So what happens then?
Yeah, well, we get a few pages of that advance towards the guns in the first place, and yeah, just men getting killed and the sort of the crazy stoicism in a way. I guess probably not the right word, stoicism, but just the crazy sort of bravery. And that, yeah, they must have seemed like giants out of myth from the Indians, because they're apparently all the Scotsmen are much bigger than Indians anyway, but with their giant bearskin hats on.
Yeah, I don't know if they. Yeah. I don't know if they were wearing them, but yeah, they were.
Not all of them. Yeah, the Highlanders were, but yeah, not everyone. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, like this like unstoppable force. There's one bit he describes where they receive the British receive some sort of volley of musketry from the Indian infantry battalions. It's after they've got to the guns, and he says it sort of doesn't really seem to do anything. It hardly takes down any of them. And it's just an interesting thing. I've got one other quote here just before they get into like the hand-to-hand melees and things. Just another sort of a wisp of colour from Cornwell. He says, quote, a gentle north wind blew a patch of gun smoke away from the centre of the enemy line where the guns were almost axle boss to axle boss. Sharpe watched men ram the barrels, watched them run clear, watched the smoke blossom again, and heard the shriek of a round shot just overhead. Sometimes Sharpe could see the tongue of dark red fire streaking towards him in the cloud's heart, and then the lead grey smoke of a ball arcing overhead, arcing towards him in the sky. And once he saw the madly spiralling wisp of smoke left by the burning fuse of a shell. End quote. But yeah, you can imagine that if you're in amongst it and you don't die for whatever reason, you're in amongst any sort of action like that and you didn't die, you probably did come close to dying loads of times, things whistling past your head loads. Like there's one other little line where he says someone's the bearskin hat like explodes, is hit by some sort of ball, but the guy underneath is absolutely fine. And you know, things like that must have just played out tons in real life, right?
Yeah. Yes. You can barely imagine the horror of it, can you? You know, it's really just appalling. We talked about this in the last video, but like just the courage or the sort of the unnatural nature of walking towards not certain death, but a very, very high chance of getting blown apart in a really horrific way. And they just maintain discipline and they just do it. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and eventually there isn't really much of an action between the infantry because they just all start running away pretty much after they see their gunners taken out, and the first volley they receive from our side, they start running away. And well, so yeah, even though historians and everyone at the time as well, even though they were sort of very well drilled and they were able to do that very good maneuver at the beginning to remaneuver their line expertly, as good as any European army, they just won't stand. They're brittle. That's what's said a couple of times, isn't it? They're brittle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they'd come. Their whole way of war was different. You know, traditionally, it was the light horseman, the raider, that kind of war, and yeah, they'd really rely on their artillery. So in a way, that once that failed, they were shattered. You know, their morale was shattered because if that their amazing, wonderful, brilliant, kind of holy, sacred artillery had failed, and that kind of devastated their morale, even though they had far greater numbers. And a lot of those numbers were just they were never really going to be effective. So there was a core, highly trained, highly skilled infantry, which made up which was a small portion of the overall Indian forces, but that portion was still way bigger than the British on the field. But still, those huge numbers of like tens of thousands, most of those were probably never really going to be effective in any battle, really. Like you say, the horsemen they wait until the enemy breaks, and then they can charge in and swoop down and drive the rout on and do loads of killing and stuff then. But they were never going to actually attack a British battalion in square or anything like that. They just wouldn't do it. So I think Wellesley was banking on the fact that if he could break the core part of the army, the rest would just melt away, and that's what happened. But they did break very, very easily, really, in the end.
Yeah, all those tens of thousands of horsemen that they're there to sweep up if and when things go their way. Yeah, and everyone says on both sides, you see both sides say it, like Pohlmann and his officer corps of Europeans, small officer corps of Europeans. On both sides, they say, you know, they don't really count for anything, really, unless it is for sweeping up purposes. They look good, but it all comes down to infantry. Even all the exchange of gunnery and all the different details and that go along with artillery warfare, it all boils down to really infantry. Whose infantry will stand? And yeah, as you say, they do sort of run away more or less straight away. Well, certainly on that flank. And so Wellesley's plan to sort of attack on our left and roll them up and push them all the way back to the town of Assay is sort of, it works on that side of the field. Yeah. And Wellesley gets a whole shot out from under him as well. Sorry, go on.
No, I just wanted to say, whilst we were insulting the cavalry, we should take a minute to insult the British cavalry as well, because there was what there was one, maybe two British regiments of horse there on the right hand side, but they also had, I think, four, something like that. They also had some native cavalry, and they were held back behind on the right hand side, basically covering that flank from any kind of attack, which the Indians weren't going to do. But then what happened was, when there was that mistake with the guy who had the Pickett's battalion marching obliquely towards Assay, he got driven back, and then the other Highland battalion marched to their rescue, and they also got stuck out there, and they formed square, whilst the enemy kind of the higher quality enemy cavalry charged in to finish them off. And then the leader of the British cavalry, was he a captain, I think, decided to, he had no orders to do it, but he decided to take almost all of his cavalry and charge forward to save the Highlanders and the Pickett's battalion that were getting destroyed out on the right. So he swept in and did a beautiful charge with his British cavalry and the native cavalry, and it was wonderful. And it drove off the Indians, who were basically driving in for the kill at that point. And that those two battalions would have been wiped out if they weren't rescued by the British cavalry. And then the British cavalry did that thing that they always do, where, flushed with success after their first charge, they just charged off. They just carried on, and they went off to the right. And I think they crossed the river and carried on pursuing the enemy cavalry just off the battlefield. And that was the last they were seen that day, which is something that cavalry do all the time. And something that happened in the Peninsular War to the British cavalry as well, repeatedly. But yeah, so they performed really, really well, but then they also screwed it up.
It's funny, that happens all through time. The cavalry do that.
Yeah.
Prince Rupert of the Rhineland in the English Civil War was known for doing that. His charge, his heavy horse charge, was unstoppable, but it was a one-shot thing because he wouldn't come back. Just kept doing that again and again.
Yeah.
So yeah, on our left, it sort of works well, even though the Highlanders and the Sepoys have got to walk through this withering fire. It is successful, but yeah, on our right, over at Assay, it's not gone well. Yeah, that guy's gone too far to the right. And when you have to form up in square, which is obviously a defensive formation, unless like sort of you have to do that. So, for example, on the afternoon at Waterloo, you sort of knew at some point we'd have to form into squares, sort of inevitable. But in the normal course of events, if you have to form into square in a battle like Assay or something smaller, something's gone wrong, right? Somebody's blundered a bit, because you shouldn't really be forced, because it's sort of a last-ditch maneuver. If sometimes it's recorded, isn't it, in accounts, that you've come over a battlefield where we've lost, or one wing has been lost, and you'll find the remnant of a square where there's just loads and loads of dead bodies, and a colour guard in the middle, all dead. So yeah, forming square is somebody's buggered up a bit. And as you say, yeah, that command, he went too far to the right. And apparently what it was, or what Cornwell tells us, I don't know actually how accurate this is, but I suspect it is accurate, that the overall commander of like one whole battalion, or one whole part of the army, someone like very, very immediately below Wellesley, was in charge of a whole army, but he was also the commander of one particular, or the 78th, the regiment of foot, the 78th. He'd been sort of promoted for this battle to have a more senior command, but he saw that his men, the 78th, were sort of at risk of being wiped out. So even though he didn't have orders to, strictly shouldn't have done it, he sends in like this big relief party, the cavalry, to relieve them, and it does work. And yeah, in the book, again, Cornwall has this Dodd sort of defending Assay and killing a lot of the pickets. That's all under Dodd and his men in the book. It's one of the only times in the battle where the Indian cavalry, they attack this square, but unsuccessfully. But it looks like they are all doomed until they are, in the nick of time, relieved. And again, Cornwall does the great thing of building, really, quite well, building the tension.
Yeah, well, it's this guy Colonel Orrock who's to blame for he's in command of the Pickets battalion.
Yeah, bloody Oric dropped the ball.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, and apparently they were in such a bad way that the remnants were using the bodies of their comrades to build a wall around in a square. So they were like using their dead friends as as a wall, basically a defensive wall to fight from behind the piles of the dead.
And horses, right? Wasn't
Yeah, and
the
horses.
horse
Yeah,
bodies?
yeah, and actually, and you're right. The relief force that went forward was the cavalry under Colonel Maxwell. But then there was also the quartermaster, basically. So at the rear with the baggage and stuff, and the guys that carry the water, he basically said, "Right, boys, listen up. We got to go and save these guys out on the right." And he put together a scratch force. He basically just gathered up all of the guys that were commanding the bullock trains and stuff, and he marched them over onto the right to relieve them, relieve the two battalions there that were getting destroyed, which is amazing because no
What a
one,
hero.
yeah, no one ordered that, um, and that was certainly not a normal thing to do. But yeah, but all of these kind of actions helped save this. Well, it was still a disaster, really. This guy Orrock completely ballsed it up, but it wasn't. They weren't completely wiped out because they were relieved by Maxwell and the quartermaster, who was James Grant, another Scotsman by the sounds of it.
Yeah, so a complete disaster was averted there. But the Indian infantry regiments, battalions, seem to be running away, at least on our left-hand side. But there is one quite important detail, is that, well, so in real life, Wellesley had two horses shot out from under him that day. Wasn't injured himself, but lost two horses. And remember, Sharpe is the guy that's shadowing him with extra horses. And so, yeah, there's what when he loses his second horse, his favourite horse, Diomed. Diomed, I think the horse is
Diomed, yeah,
called Diomed.
Diomed,
Yeah,
yeah,
his beloved Diomed that cost him 400 guineas or something.
yeah.
At one point is killed, and Wellesley is well. So at one point on the right, the enemy gunners somehow get back behind the British and are manning their guns again.
Well, they'd
Amazing, weirdly.
yeah, well, a lot of them had surrendered, so they'd taken two volleys and then they'd taken a bayonet charge, but the survivors who had like surrendered or played dead in some cases. Once the British battalions had advanced beyond them, they sort of jumped up, turned their guns around, and started firing on the rear of the British.
Cheeky bastards.
Yeah, yeah, it's horrific. Yeah, they're a genuine danger. Like that could have that would have turned the battle again because that was the strongest part of the army basically, and the fact that the gun crews were brave enough to do that
Mm, mm.
is remarkable. You know, that just shows again that really the core of their army was the artillery.
Yeah, it was really ballsy of them. I was about to say something else along the lines of what a cheap shot, what a sucker punch. But it's actually really brave thinking about it, isn't it, to do that?
It is, yeah,
So Wellesley sees it, obviously he clocks it immediately, and just straight away orders a couple of lines of cavalry that are nearby to line up and retake those positions. But it's sort of the danger's sort of so immediate that even he and his entourage and Sharpe are sort of ordered to line up and charge towards them. And that's the bit actually when Sharpe says, "I'm surprised I would ever enter my first big battle as a cavalryman." And in that in that episode, that moment, that's when in real life Wellesley lost his second horse. It was shot out from him, and he was dazed apparently. And in the book, it's Sharpe. They're in amongst the enemy, and Sharpe single-handedly saves him. He's sort of dazed, not completely unconscious, but Wellesley's dazed on the ground, having been unhorsed, and Sharpe drags him to sort of the very mediocre safety of a gun carriage, sort of plops him under the gun, and then fights off loads of enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. Like a dozen, kills a dozen or something, and they
yeah,
keep coming. They nearly
ridiculous.
get Wellesley, but he saves him every time, and he like chops their throats out, and yeah, he goes crazy, he goes berserk mode.
Yeah, Yeah, he goes berserk mode, and Wellesley's like so dazed. He's like he's not sure. He can't believe what he's seeing. So he thinks, "Oh, I must have taken a really bad spill there. 'Cause this can't be real." But yeah, it's something. Obviously, there was no Sharpe historically, but Wellesley was in danger of dying there. And he never really spoke about exactly what happened, did he? He never really gave a detailed account, but apparently he did get his sword wet in that action. So he did have to fight for his life, probably. But typical kind of Wellesley, he never really talked about it. It was just, just going to work for him, really.
Yeah, I've heard it said that that's the closest he ever came to being killed in action. Was that at Assay? As you say, got his sword wet. Like he actually came to blows with the enemy. I mean, it's mad, really.
Yeah. Well,
The
apparently
major general.
yeah, apparently Diomed got an enemy lance in the chest. So obviously they were close enough to do that, and again, like if that lancer had decided to go for the rider rather than the horse, then that might have been the end of Wellesley.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a little bit here from the book. It's at that moment. And he took a bit of apparently in the melee. Sharpe did take a blow, but he says this quote of Sharpe: "His shoulder was bleeding, but there was no pain. He was keening a mad noise as he fought, and it seemed to Sharpe that in that instant he could do nothing wrong. It was as if the enemy had been magically slowed to half speed, and he had been quickened. He was much taller than any of them, and much stronger, and he was suddenly much faster. He was even enjoying the fight." So like he saves him, and there's a bit earlier in the novel where he mentions to McCandless that he has got pretensions of being an officer one day. And McCandless tells him, it's really, really unlikely, it hardly ever happens, and it never works out well. It's not a good life. No, you won't be accepted in sort of the officer class. Because, that's the other thing. At one point, Pohlmann tries to seduce Sharpe over to the other side. That theme came up a lot in Sharpe's Tiger, but it comes up again here. He's like, Pohlmann himself offers Sharpe to be an officer in the Scandia's army.
Yeah.
But Sharpe turns it down. But he does tell McCandless that he would like to be an officer at some point. And anyway, he saves Wellesley in that moment in the battle. But there's one other quick quote I would want to say from the book, which I think just gives a good. It's Cornwell spatters these little bits all throughout his books, and I think they're great. They're sort of a general sort of musing almost on what war or battle might have been like. But he wrote this about Sharpe at the point when he's going into battle. He said, quote, "He drew the heavy weapon which felt unnatural in his hand, but then this whole battle seemed unnatural. It swung from moments of bow-loosening terror to sudden calm, and then back to terror again. It ebbed and flowed, flaring in one part of the field, then dying down as the tide of killing passed to another patch of June-coloured farmland." End quote. Oh, so yeah, it's really hot. It's a really hot day.
Yeah. So and that is what at the end of the book ultimately gets Sharpe his promotion to his commission to ensign, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, actually, I rewatched the first TV show, Sharpe's Rifles. I rewatched most of that the other day, and in that, it's already in the Peninsular War, and Sharpe's a sergeant, and it's one of the first scenes. I think it's actually the first scene where Wellesley's just it's a morning, and he's just sort of trotting about, just enjoying the air, and he gets ambushed by like three or four or five Frenchmen.
It's really bad.
Yeah, it's quite low, but there's not that many extras, are there, in the TV show?
No.
And he comes galloping back towards his lines, and but falls off his horse or something, and Sharpe single-handedly saves him, like sees off these three or four French cavalrymen and saves him, and is sort of almost immediately, or sort of on the spot, raised to be a lieutenant by Wellesley, and that's at the very beginning of Sharpe's Rifles, the first TV show. So yeah, they redo it a bit, rejig it a bit for that. But
On y va.
Better late than never, Hogan. What's your name?
Sharpe. Sergeant. 2nd Battalion, 95th Rifles, sir.
I'm much obliged to you. You did me a damn good turn. Now I'm gonna do you a damn bad one. I'm giving you a field commission, Sharpe. From this moment on, you're a lieutenant in the 95th. Major Hogan, meet Mr. Sharpe.
Congratulations. Capital choice, sir. The minute I saw him, I looked. Hogan says, aye, that fellow don't seem much, but he's a natural-born officer.
Yeah, so at the very end of this book, at the very end, literally the last few pages, because it says here that after Wellesley saves, after Sharpe saves Wellesley in that moment, and that the immediate danger is over, some other of our cavalry come up and they're sort of safe. Wellesley is lost for words and doesn't know how to thank Sharpe. And doesn't thank him, and Sharpe's a bit pissed off actually at that. But at the very, very end, that evening, Wellesley finds Sharpe and says, "Well, thanks for saving my life," and shakes his hand. And it's like getting a handshake from Paul Hollywood. Like, you can't quite believe it. It's a bit more than getting a handshake from Paul Hollywood, actually. Sharpe can't believe the gesture that Sir Arthur would shake his hand, and it makes him an officer. And so Sharpe gets his wish.
Yeah, it's obviously a great moment for the character, but apparently there was a guy who was promoted from a sergeant to an officer at Assay, but it was an Indian guy, one of the sepoy guys. His name was Syed Hussain, and he was a havildar in the native cavalry, and havildar is like a sergeant. Apparently, during a cavalry charge into the enemy, he captured a standard and took the standard back to his commanding officer, and then his commanding officer was a guy called John Malcolm, who knew Wellesley. They'd served together. Yeah, so he took him back to Wellesley and said, "This guy, this havildar, just got this standard." And this was recalled in a letter by this John Malcolm years later in 1818, and he wrote to Wellesley, recalling how after being given the standard by this havildar, he says, quote, "You," as in Wellesley, "patted him upon the back, and with that eloquent and correct knowledge in the native language for which you were celebrated, said, 'Achar Havildar, Jemadar.' A Jemadar he was made, and amid all his subsequent success in Persia and in India, which have raised him to medals, pensions, and a palanquin from government, his pride is a pat on the back he received at Assay," end quote. And this guy Hussain retired as a subadar, which is a more senior officer. So there was a guy, an Indian guy, but not Sharpe.
That's mad, isn't it? I love all the real details of things, and the Sharpe novels are largely really accurate. I think that's why they're so great. I'm not sure if you can say that about sort of I don't want to cast shadow. I was about to say Master and Commander or Hornblower or something, but they are also quite good. But I think Sharpe, the Bernard Cornwell Sharpe ones are sort of really on the money nearly all the time.
in a way, like I think in terms of historical events, he's pretty good. Like the big historical events, he's pretty good. Although obviously he does invent stuff and he does shift the timescales around to suit his story, which is fine. Obviously that's fine. But I think the Patrick O'Brien's books are more accurate in terms of how people are in them. The characters are more true to the time period, where I think Cornwell's characters are more like, they behave more like modern people rather than people from 200 years ago generally. But in terms of the events and stuff, he's pretty good. He's pretty good. Yeah,
so in the battle then, those guys on the right near Assay that had to form into square, they are relieved, and most of the infantry, the Indian infantry, retreat, and they close in on Assay itself. And it's well in the book it sort of Cornwell ties it up sort of quite quickly really after that. Dodd gets away. He features in the next one, and he does just sort of escape and get away. And the French officer Joubert I mentioned, with the beautiful young wife Simone, Dodd murders him, and And in Pohlmann, it's funny actually. It's a funny little bit at the end where Pohlmann, in order to escape, dresses back in his old East India Company as a sergeant, and Sharpe comes across him when they are sort of investing Assay itself, and Sharpe doesn't care, doesn't arrest him or kill him or anything. He just says, "I don't care what you do. I don't care about you." Oh, there's one other bit I must mention, that in the fight, in Sharpe's hand-to-hand fight to sort of save Arthur Wellesley and kills dozens of guys, at one point someone does slash him on the back of the neck with a sword, but it doesn't kill him because he's wearing the giant ruby in his hair.
Oh yeah.
On the back of his neck, essentially on the back of his neck, and the sword hits the ruby, and although it sort of jars him, it doesn't cut him at all. And it falls out, and this giant ruby falls to the ground. And Wellesley afterward picks it up and gives it back to him, which is all a bit fantastic. But great.
Like, it must have been a bit of glass or something. Like it must have been like a brick stone. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, and so yeah, they type all that thing. And one other thing that happens, one other sort of big thing for sort of the plot or going forward with the Sharpe series, is that again in the streets, in the back alleys, in the confusion when they're taking Assay, Hakeswill and his small group of sort of 5 or 6 dudes, evil dudes loyal to him, they come across McCandless alone in an alley because McCandless has ripped up this warrant, this arrest warrant, which Hakeswill had for Sharpe earlier. McCandless just ripped it up and said that when we get back to safety, I'm going to take you, Hakeswill, up on charges for lying or for creating a false warrant. And so Hakeswill's in trouble. So anyway, in the alley, right at the very, very end of the book, Hakeswill kills McCandless, just shoots him at point blank range in the throat, kills him instantly.
Yeah.
Which is sad because McCandless is a good character. He's really sort of you're on board with him, isn't he? He's a sympathetic.
Yeah, he's a great character. Yeah, really great. Yeah.
And Hakeswill, the bastard, just kills him dead. And so that's sort of the end of that book, more or less, isn't it? There is one quote actually from an Indian at the time that, again, Cornwell says at the end in his historical note, an observer, a witness at the time, talking about that earlier escalade. At that town earlier in the story. Apparently he wrote this. He said, "These English are a strange people, and their general a wonderful man. They came here in the morning, looked at the Petar wall, walked over it, killed all the garrison, and returned to breakfast. What can withstand them?" End quote. Which is nice.
It's a brilliant quote. Brilliant quote. Yeah, it just kind of shows the quality of the men that were there, doesn't it? You know, just remarkable, really. Remarkable officers and remarkable men. Yeah.
And one last thing, I suppose, just to put a bow tie on it, is that the Cornwell gives a tiny sort of line or two of his judgment on it, and it's that quote you said in our last video on Tiger that years later, I think when Wellesley was Prime Minister, or even after that, someone asked him, "What's your greatest moment, your greatest military victory?" And he just said, "Assay," without hesitation. And about that, Cornwell says, "And so it surely was, for he outmaneuvered and outfought a much larger enemy and did it swiftly, brutally, and brilliantly. And he did it too without Colonel Stevenson's help," end quote, which is all true.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Just the remarkable aggression of it. I think what were the casualties? He lost about 500 men, was it?
Yeah, Wiki is saying 428 killed, 18 missing. About 1,100 wounded.
Right.
And they lost maybe 6,000 with another 1,200 possibly wounded. They lost practically all their guns.
Yeah, so it didn't finish the war by any means,
No.
but it did damage them severely, and it was it had a political impact. It showed the momentum of the British, I guess, and further isolated Scindia from potential allies, and deprived them of 100 fantastic guns and the crews. So it was a significant success, but the war was not over.
Yeah, the Second Anglo-Maratha War isn't done. They've still got their stronghold at Goligura. Say it again for me.
Garil Gur.
Yeah, but Assay is certainly the decisive field battle. Absolutely,
Yeah.
there's no doubt about that. All historians agree that that was sort of the decisive thing. Yeah, all the momentum is with us. They're on the back foot. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so any other thoughts or words?
No, just that was a really good book.
It's a page turner for sure.
Yeah, a page turner, and I think the action, the second half of the next book, is written even better, in my opinion. I think that was the last time I read that. I was as enthralled by the attack on the fort than as any other Bernard Cornwell book that I've read. It's fantastic.
Cool. So that's Sharpe's Fortress up next. All right. Well, thanks for your time, Dan, and we'll leave it there. And yeah, Sharpe's Fortress next.
Thanks very much.
Here's 40 shillings on the drum for those who volunteer to come to list and fight the foe today over the hills and far away. O'er the hills and o'er the plain, through Flanders, Portugal and Spain, King George commands and we obey, over the hills and far away. When duty calls me, I must go to stand